Sell a property. All right, great. We started in, we want to sell property in today's world. We've got to make adjustments. We've got pricing. Well, good morning, everybody. So we've done this many times before, but we're going to do it again. And there have been some changes since the last revision of the RPA. But let's just go from the very beginning. When creating the RPA, I'm not going to go through all the additional forms that are accompanying it because it's just going to take our time. But when we begin, we're going to insert the date prepared, and I have a date prepared of, let's change that. Just change that, right? What is the date today?
16th, that's
15th, that's right, tax day. It's funny stuff. So I'm preparing this offer today. And this reference date is critical for any other documents that you create, addenda, so on and so forth, that reference the RPA. So remember, it's not, if you reference the RPA with an addendum or any other document, we don't talk about the date that the document is actually signed or executed. We reference the date prepared. Good morning. Okay, this is interesting. It's an offer from Richard Moore. And the property to be acquired is 12 Longview, and that's my former residence, as a matter of fact. About 3 or 4 years ago, I can't remember, it's been so long. But to populate all this information, one of the best things you can do is to use, when you're going into create a purchase contract, use something called MLS Connect. Click on the button, it's going to populate all the information that the listing agent has inserted into the listing itself, so you don't have to put on the license numbers for the listing agent, APN numbers, a lot of information. It saves you time, and the accuracy is highly likely to be better, to more effective. And then let's see, an agency disclosure. This is required by law. And so section 2B, we'll just skip 2A, but 2B, if you use MLS Connect, it's going to populate the seller's brokerage firm, who the seller's agent is, their license numbers. It's going to populate, we'll insert the buyer's brokerage firm. And since I'm the buyer and I'm both the agent, there are some implications, and I intentionally made myself both the buyer and the agent of this transaction. So it's critical, you need to specify who is representing who. Now, in the seller's brokerage firm, it's Carlos Rodriguez, Global Bank of Platinum Properties. And you can see Richard Moore representing the buyer. In the event the transaction is under the same brokerage license, it is considered to be dual agency, and we would check the box, both buyer and seller. If for some reason it's another entity and it's a different brokerage number, then we could say, for example, we could change that. Change that, but I want to change that. So if it's a different brokerage, then we would specify that Carlos is representing the seller, Richard Morris representing the buyer. Simple, right? But now we know that we're both under the same license area. And then section C, in the event there's more than one brokerage representing the buyer or seller, there would be something called an additional broker acknowledgement. That doesn't happen very often. I thought I'd point that out. And then section D, potentially competing buyers and sellers. The box is checked by default. It's not something I did or could undo, as a matter of fact. So the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller is attached to the purchase contract. So with the purchase contract, section 3A, simply the purchase price, putting in $1 million. Now, if we were to check all cash under additional terms, there is no loan contingency. You don't have to waive the loan contingency. It's deemed to be, if you look at the detail below us here, it already defines that as if there is no loan contingency. But we're going to remove that at this point in time. So we're saying it's not an all cash offer. Close of escrow, 30 days after acceptance. And how do we define acceptance? Well, if I'm the buyer and I submit a purchase contract to the seller, so I've signed it, I've submitted it to the seller. Tomorrow, the seller signs and returns it to me. Actually, what the seller signs today, they don't return them tomorrow. The date of acceptance is the date that it's returned to the last party. So not the date of the last signature, but the date that it's conveyed or returned to that party. So keep that in mind, it's true with counteroffers also.
Rich, what happens if the 30 days lands on the weekend holiday?
If it does, then the close of escrow would fall to the following business day. When there are instances, if there is a legal holiday on that Monday, it would fall to Tuesday, for example. And then it would be default in that part. Section D1, initial deposit. Now I'm going to say that I'm putting $30,000 down. And the 3% is simply just a system calculation of the purchase price. So the percent number above is for calculation purposes only, and it's not a contractual term. So if we were to change the purchase price to $2 million, I'm still only obligated for my initial deposit to deposit $30,000. So keep that in mind. And there's a difference, because if we were to increase the purchase price to $2 million, the loan amount is going to adjust. And so that is something that will adjust on a percentage basis or per round basis. And then to the right, this is the only aspect in which we're talking about business days in a purchase contract. It states within 3, and I've changed it to 1 business day after acceptance by wire transfer. So we're talking about the initial deposit. So remember, if we allow the default, if I'm a listing agent, I don't want a buyer to wait 3 business days, because if the contract is signed on and delivered on Friday, that buyer has until the following Wednesday to deliver their earnest money or initial deposit. That's a long time. And it gives people the opportunity to think, God, maybe I don't want to do this. So not only that, when you're representing a buyer, we want to keep them moving along also. So let's be a little more aggressive and maybe change it to 1 or 2 business days and not allow them 3 business days, but also sends a message to the seller that I really want this property. Any questions about that? No? Okay, then section D2, increased deposit. It's kind of a rarity. I'm just going to skip over that. There can be milestones, for example, that may be met during the transaction. If somebody gets to the time which they're removing contingencies, that maybe there could be a condition such that the buyer has an obligation to deposit additional money. But even if they deposit additional money, if it's a primary residence transaction, in no case is the buyer subjected to liquidated damages in excess of 3% of the purchase price. If it is an investment property, there is no limitation in regards to what the percentage of liquidated damages consists of. So something you're going to occupy, then it's a limitation of 3%. You're not going to occupy the property. If I put 10% down for my initial deposit, it's investment property, I default. Then I could be subject to losing possibly the full 10%. And then E1, the loan amount. Do we have a check? Yes, we do. Okay. I'm just assuming I'm going to borrow $800,000, so 80% of the purchase price. And then what's important to us, you can see there's 2 bullet points. One says not to exceed. I inserted 7%. And this creates a contingency for the buyer. If rates today go up to 7.5%, that's the prevailing rate. Even if I qualify, I can cancel because the rate today exceeds the threshold that I've inserted in. And then buyer to pay up to 0 points, so take the rate above. I don't want to pay any points to get that 7% rate. Now, when you're presenting an offer, keep in mind that the listing agent, if they're smart enough, they're going to say rates today are at 7.5%. So why would I accept your offer? They should counter. They'll expect them to counter something that gives some type of cushion in the event rates go higher. So maybe 7 3/4. So keep that in mind. And then to the right, the type of financing that is presumed is conventional financing. If in the event the buyer is getting an FHA, VA, or seller type of financing, we would check the appropriate box. And then if it is FHA or VA financing, a form that's going to be attached is the amendatory clause. And the amendatory clause is simply associated with VA or FHA financing. And it's an additional condition favoring the buyer such that if the appraisal does not come into the purchase price, the buyer can cancel without any repercussions, no loss of deposit, for example. And that's true even if they remove the appraisal contingency. So a dilemma, when you're a listing agent and you're accepting somebody who's submitting an FHA or VA loan. Well, if the appraisal comes in lower and the buyer decides, I'm not sure if I want to cancel on that, they can take that transaction all the way up to the end of time or the suggested close of escrow. Even if they remove that contingency and the day before, they can now cancel the transaction. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, we don't see a lot of FHA or VA loans in Orange County. Riverside County, it's very predominant. But it's just something to keep in mind when you have issues like that, or an issue that could arise, for example. And then with FHA or VA financing, there could be other requirements. You know, homes that maybe have, I'm trying to think of the material they used to use a long time ago. Thank you. Some of the stucco, there could be stucco repairs, things like that, if there's asbestos involved. And if it's an FHA loan, you're gonna have to hire someone specifically who's licensed to address asbestos repairs. So they're going to require documentation that it's somebody's licensed to do that. There we go.
Hello.
Any questions about that?
Sorry, I'm late.
And then in regards to the mandatory clause also, you would expect the lender will also, if they don't accept this form, they're gonna provide the buyer with the buyer with an mandatory clause that's going to have to be signed. So that's something that's very common with lenders that are providing FHA or VA finance. And then we go down to E2, additional finance amount. Let's assume a buyer is getting a first and second loan, or there's seller financing provided, well, we would check the appropriate box. So we're still in first page, actually. Yeah, and that's E2, right? Section E3, occupancy type, primary or check, secondary or investment. Well, why is that important? Because if their buyer's getting a loan, and what if they actually are not going to buy this as a primary residence? Well, we should be sure that the appropriate box is checked. And not only that, if they're getting evidence of a approval letter or pre-qualification letter, it should reference the fact that it is an investment property and not a primary residence. And I'm telling you, it's interesting, every 2 weeks or so, just the other day, I have someone that asked me, well, it's really going to be for investment, but they're going to get a loan as if they're going to occupy the property. It's a loan fraud. Don't do it. And then the underwriters are very smart. They're going to look at the conditions. Well, how far are you living? Are you moving into a smaller home? And you're buying a property a mile away. They're going to look at all of these aspects and make some kind of determination. And they have the right to perform an inspection of the property. So, and then how else can you tell that somebody occupied the property? Well, did they change their mailing address, their bank statements, all these other aspects? So it's not worth it to try and save a little bit of money, because they can call that loan to a table, and they will. So the system will generate the balance of the down payment under section F. Questions about that? And then the next page, section G, seller payments to cover buyer expenses and costs. Section G then, seller credit to buyer. So when getting a loan, lenders are going to make a determination. They'll allow credits up to a certain percentage of the purchase price. So the higher the loan to value, the lower the credit that the lender is going to permit. So if I'm borrowing 90%, the lender may only permit $10,000 in seller granted credits. If I'm borrowing $500,000 out of $1 million transaction, I'm going to get the maximum, which is probably 6% of the purchase price. So we'll allow that much as a matter. And in the event we now are in our example, this purchase price is $1 million. If we negotiate a final purchase price of $2 million, the seller credit is not going to adjust based upon a percentage. It is simply going to be whatever the dollar amount is that you put. So if I put $20,000 in here, no matter what the purchase price is, that's exactly what I would be told. And then additional seller credit terms does not include buyer broker compensation. Well, I guess you can name any number of things in there in terms of the amount of credit you want. Why is section G1, G2, and G3 separated? Seller credit to buyer, additional seller credit. And then section G3, seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate buyer's broker. When a lender is calculating the maximum allowable credit that is permitted, they will not include the seller's payment to the buyer's broker when determining the maximum credit. So that's why we would separate that out, and that's why the contract is separated out. And then another aspect in regards to seller credits to buyers. So let's assume I negotiate successfully a $30,000 credit for my buyer. And that my total closing is for closing costs, my total closing costs are $20,000. If I don't address that, I'm going to lose that $10,000 difference. So the contract states specifically that any unused credits will be lost. So the way to address that in the purchase contract, we would state something like that, like any unused credits will be reflected as a dollar for dollar reduction in the purchase price. So no matter what, if you're negotiating seller credits, you should always include some kind of language indicating that any unused credit will be reflected as a direct reduction in the purchase price. Any questions about that?
Yes, please. I mean, the credit for the closing costs is clear. If there's an additional cost, for instance, $5,000 to fix an HVAC system or something, that's not going to happen until after the deal's closed. So,
Well, we're gonna repair it, or we're just gonna get a credit for it?
just a credit for it.
Just a credit for it. Well, if we had in G1 a $20,000 credit, and if for some reason in section G2 said another $5,000 credit in lieu of AC repairs, you're gonna be limited to, well, you're gonna get a $25,000 credit.
Right.
And then the letter may, first of all, what we never really want to do, we don't want to specify that there's a credit in lieu of repair, because then that tells the lender the collateral is impaired, meaning there's deficiencies in the property and I'm not going to grant that credit. I'm going to want that AC unit repaired. So you have to be careful about that. And, you know, the request for repairs is kind of awkward in that regard, because a lot of times we'll see we want all these different things fixed, and then the seller comes back and says, well, instead of fixing it, I'll just grant you a credit. Now, when you ultimately sign that, there's going to be an escrow amendment reflecting the credit, but then the lender, they're going to want to see the underlying document associated with that escrow amendment granting that credit. And that may cause them to say, well, you know, we want all these deficiencies in the property corrected. So those are issues. So a lot of times through the negotiations, what I simply suggest is, once you get to that point that there's just going to be a credit issue, then maybe you just issue an addendum, $10,000 credit in lieu of closing costs, or towards closing costs. Just make it simple that way. Because the seller doesn't have to complete it. So that sometimes tends to be a better way, so it doesn't flag or cause the lender to look at the property and think, I need these repairs done, because the property isn't worth this much because it needs a new AC system that's going to cost $15,000. And then this is very important, section G3, seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate buyer's broker. If you're representing the buyer and you want the seller to pay the buyer's agent's commission, then you need to complete this block. And I can assure you that I've witnessed examples in which it wasn't completed and the seller did not pay the agent's commission. So that's a hardship, right? Now you're working for free possibly, depending upon how you fill out the buyer representations, what the compensation agreement. And so here's something I just want to point out. I've got 3% here. I'm saying, or the buyer saying, Mr. Seller, I want you to pay my agent 3% of the final purchase price. Now I'm going to pull up my buyer representation broker compensation agreement that I had my buyer sign. Now let's just go through this quickly because this is very important. Date prepared, well, I just put today's date. And then got the name of the buyer, the broker, and then a section A1, representation period. It's beginning April 15th. And it's ending July 15th, on the 15th of July. If you make this for longer than 3 months, it's not enforceable. So you can lose out as a matter of fact. And then section A2, type of representation, well, I want exclusive. That's what I want. So no matter what that buyer purchases, I'm entitled to compensation. Now, people get nervous about that, but the ability for the buyer to cancel is there, and it's no more than a 30-day cancellation notice. If you don't choose exclusive, they can send you notification today, and the buyer representation broker compensation agreement is terminated. So the type of properties B1, I'm going to just say single family homes. I can exclude, or I can include all these other properties. Then the simplest way to identify the property is the location. Just type in the counties. Right? Could be Orange, San Diego, Riverside. Make it expansive. There's nothing wrong with that. And section C, additional buyer preferences. This is not obligatory. So if they want certain things they want you to search for, if I'm an agent representing a buyer, I'm just going to kind of skip over that. And then properties excluded from representation. Let's say, for example, somebody had a representation agreement signed with your buyer, and they made an offer on their property or selling their property. Maybe they don't want to be obligated to pay you in the form of agent. So you might exclude that property if there's this concern. And then here's the key aspect of this, section E1, amount of compensation, 2% of the acquisition price. So you notice I put 2% in here, but what did I put in the purchase contract? 3%. 3%. Now, what does that mean? 4%. The seller has no obligation to pay. It's
Pay
worse than
period?
that.
Okay, period.
Pay, period. And that's why I wanted to emphasize this. Yes, and the language is right in the purchase contract. So if we look at section G3, buyer firmly represents that at the time this offer is made, buyer has a written agreement with buyer's broker that is valid, covers the property, and provides for compensation no less than the amount stated above. So if you have a 2% buyer representation agreement, don't ask for any more than 2% on the purchase contract. Otherwise, seller has no obligation to pay. In my buyer representation agreement, I said 2%. If I put 1% in here, that's fine. Then your buyer has the obligation to pay that 1% differential. So yeah, that would be ugly, huh? And not only that, but people ask, do I have to submit my representation agreement with the offer? No, you have no obligation to do that. However, after contract acceptance, if the listing agent and or seller request it, then you do have an obligation to present that to them. And usually listing agent should be asked.
Doesn't escrow need it?
Escrow may need it in the event the buyer has to pay. So if the buyer is going to pay a 1% differential, they're going to need documentation. So escrow may request it. And I think escrows are still figuring that out. But if they do request it, I would suggest you send it. So there's no issue with that. And then section E3, we're back to the buyer representation agreement. The continuation period shall be 90 calendar days after the representation period or any extension. So just like a listing contract, there is this so-called protection clause. My listing expires now, and the seller doesn't want to renew with me. I can provide them a list of names of buyers that enter the property and shown property. And if they buy it within, in my example, 90 days, I'm entitled to compensation. Same thing is true of this buyer representation agreement. If I've shown them properties and before the expiration or 5 days after the buyer has canceled the contract, if I provide them with a list of properties I've shown them and they buy their property within 90 days, I'm entitled to compensation. So I would suggest inserting that at least 90 to 100 days in there as a matter of fact. And then section F, this is still the buyer representation agreement cancellation rights and notice. If I didn't check exclusive above, they could just submit cancellation within 1 day. So 30 days is the max for the notice period if it is an exclusive agreement. Let's see. And then section G1, time to deliver buyer personal financial information to the buyer's agent. I can just gloss over that. And then section G2, I would never check this box where it says buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. So just think if you check this box and you submit an offer and the seller refuses to pay, or worse yet, you submit an offer and you submit the BRBC with your offer and the seller sees that. If I'm the seller, I'm gonna say, huh, I'm not paying you, I don't care, you know, because no one has to pay the buyer's agent then. And at that point in time, you can disavow your agency, so you don't have to work for free completely, but you lose on the transaction.
You're very disruptive.
And then the rest is just a signature. Now, I will have to admit, I have never sent a BRBC out, so I don't know under section 15 if I've checked the box exclusive. If the initials are going to show up there, it's just probably optional, but you must have that paragraph initial to confirm exclusive representation. Right? If you don't have exclusive representation, then it doesn't. Any questions about the buyer representation agreement? Okay. So we're all clear then and confident about section 3G3 of the purchase contract in terms of what we can insert in there. So now that I realize that my buyer representation agreement was only 2%, I'm going to change that to 2%. So I don't want to work for free. Okay. Now, we're on the RPA again, section H1, verification of all cash. Now, sometimes in past iterations of a purchase contract, the default was not the same here. The default for section H1, H2, and H3 is all the same. That means I have actually attached this documentation to the purchase contract. So don't check the box. So if you have the verification of funds, you have the verification of down payment closing costs, and you have the verification of loan application, don't check these boxes. This is saying after acceptance, I'm going to provide these documents. So if I check the box, verification of all cash, that means after acceptance, I'm going to provide that. I would say most listing agents probably not going to entertain your offer too seriously without verification of money, financing, so on and so forth. And then section H3 to the far right, I check pre-approval. There's pre-qualification, fully underwritten approval. But pretty much the difference between pre-qualification and pre-approval is somewhat simple. Pre-qual, I've contacted my lender and I've told them verbally I earn $500,000 a year. And then they're going to run my credit report. So that's it. A pre-qualification, I've been asked to provide pay stubs and other documentation. So pre-approval, in my opinion, has much more validity or credibility than just a pre-qualification. And then pre-qualification letter, pre-approval letter, remember, if it's a primary residence, it should specify. If it's an investment property, it should address that. And that's something you should be looking at as a listing agent. And then section J, final verification of condition. Well, before the close of escrow, we'll entitled to walk through the property to see if it's in the same condition as of the date of acceptance. The only change would be if I have a request for repairs and the seller agreed to repair certain aspects of the property. Other than that, now this is about the only warranty you get in the property. So let's assume, date of acceptance, the stove's working or the AC is working. And then you go through the final walkthrough and it's not working. Well, they have an obligation to correct that. But this is not a license for you in that 5-day review before you close to look for other deficiencies in property and say, I want these things fixed, right? So that would probably be a breach of contract suddenly if you don't cancel, or if you cancel because you found other things that you were aware of at the time of acceptance. And then assignment request, section K. 17 days, we see far more assignment requests today than ever. Now, an assignment request is simply, I signed the purchase contract as Richard Moore, but now I want to assign my interest into my family trust. The seller, if I'm the sole beneficiary of the family trust, cannot deny the assignment. If I transfer it into an LLC in which I'm the sole owner of that LLC, the seller cannot deny that assignment. But if I transfer it to another entity in which I'm not the sole owner, now the seller has various rights, and they can come back to say, all right, that's fine, I may consider it. But you need to prove to me that the LLC you signed it to has a pre-approval letter, they have proof of funds, other aspects like that. So there's a form called the assignment of agreement addendum that would be used to document this. And even in the event everybody signs that, it does not relinquish my obligation as Richard Moore, the original purchaser, in regards to closing escrow. And then with an assignment of agreement, if it's assigned to an entity, remember within 3 days, they have to provide proof of that entity and the people representing that entity as to who has authority to act on behalf of that entity. Because if it's an operating agreement, an LLC, for example, the members or managers have authority to act on behalf of that LLC. So you need to look at that operating agreement. Escrow is going to look at it, title is going to look at it. So that's all very important because if it requires 2 members or managers of an LLC to enter in or engage in purchase of real estate, if only one signed, it may not be enforceable. You want to know that. Likewise for the trust, same thing, right? Section L1, loans, 17 days after acceptance. So that's simply the time, the default time frame for the contingency period. We can check no loan contingency. That's good. Appraisal, section L2, appraisal contingency based upon appraised value at a minimum purchase price or. Now, it's not happening today, but in the past when the market was exceptionally hot, maybe means the buyer knew that I'm paying $100,000 more than I should. Maybe the property was really only $900,000. And to show the seller just how interested I am in this property and I'm willing to pay $1 million for, I can insert $900,000 in there. If the appraisal comes in at $900,000 or more, then I can't cancel based upon the appraised value. So the difference, that $100,000 in our example, between the purchase price and the amount it should appraise at is called the appraisal gap. And no matter what, that $100,000 would be applicable even if the price goes up. So that can be a way, if you're in a competitive situation, to make your offer more palatable. Then you can say no appraisal contingency. So let's assume I don't waive my appraisal contingency and the appraisal comes in lower. I'm going to remove this $900,000. Or excuse me, the appraisal comes in at the purchase price, but the square footage is 500 square feet lower than what I thought I was getting. What are the implications there? Can you cancel based upon the appraisal contingency? The answer is no. The appraisal is simply an opinion value, nothing more than that. So if the square footage comes in lower on the appraisal versus what you thought you were buying, you can cancel based upon the investigation contingency. Well, why is that important? Because if you submit a cancellation and it's done incorrectly, well, maybe the seller is not going to contest it and try to keep it positive. So it's very important in regards to how we approach any cancellation. And I always suggest if you're ever in a transaction that's being canceled, that you would contact me so we can look at the circumstances of the transaction. Let's see. And then L3, investigation of property. There's a lot of aspects that fall into that, reviewing the seller disclosures, for example. So it's pretty broad. And that if we're going to cancel a transaction, that's probably one of the main reasons we're going to cancel, because it's such a broad universe of things that a buyer's looking at. And then if we're ever canceling a transaction, we don't have any obligation to tell them the exact circumstances. We're just going to cite a contingency. You better have a good faith reason, and hopefully more than one good faith reason for canceling. Because if they contest releasing the buyer's deposit, you may then have to come forward with whatever those reasons are. And that can consist of various things. Word nuisance, condition. What if you have repairs and the seller agrees to all the repairs. Maybe I don't want to agree to that. Maybe we have, let's see, Holden's transactions are $27,000 in termite repairs. That's a lot. Well, that's a lot. That's great. You're willing to fix it. Maybe I don't want that house simply because to me, that's egregious. And I don't want to get involved with it. So that is a valid reason to cancel, even if they're willing to correct those repairs or deficiencies in the property. Insurance is a separate contingency. It was never called out separately before, but if insurance is now a big issue, when you're representing a buyer, you better have them confirming the cost of their insurance premiums, even if they can obtain insurance, because they may be obligated to go to the California Health Law. Would you want to do that? That's a good question. But insurance is a specific contingency. It does not fall under the investigation contingency, so you can cancel based upon insurance. And insurance is not just obtaining insurance, but it can also be the prohibitive cost associated with obtaining insurance policies too. That is now a valid reason for canceling the purchase contract.
Because their insurance is too much?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. If we look at the body of the RPA, it specifies not just obtaining, but also the cost of insurance. Or there have been, let's face it, slab leaks in the property before and more than one insurance claim associated with that property. Any new insurer is going to look at that and probably say, no, I don't want to do that, no matter what you're willing to pay. You review seller documents, all the seller disclosures, transfer disclosure statements, so on and so forth. We'll go through some of those as a matter of fact. The preliminary title reports. So that's important. I always suggest you look through that. If you're buying homes in Irvine, pretty vanilla. You're buying a house in Laguna Beach or some other area, which everything is different. There can be various aspects that may impact the seller negative, excluding the buyer negatively. I've used this example many times before, going back to this property in Laguna Beach, which represented the seller. It turns out that there's a recording going back to 1954. The people bordering the street were obligated to maintain the street. So, and how do you find that? You've got these active links in the prelim. You drill down, find out what's reported against it. Now, it should have been also separately disclosed, but that was our argument in regards to we did provide you adequate disclosure. So the buyer lost that one, fortunately. And then common interest disclosures. This is really important as a matter of fact. So most homes have an HOA or management company. Now there's a difference. There could be CC&Rs reported, but there's not necessarily an HOA management company. So when you're looking at the seller's disclosures, and it asks you specifically, are there CC&Rs reported? Sometimes because people aren't paying HOA fees, they think that there are no CC&Rs. So on the TDS, when I ask that question, the seller may be responding incorrectly. So we should be looking at the prelim to see if there are any CC&Rs reported. So that's important also. And then there can be more than one HOA. So we many times rely on sellers to tell us how many HOAs there are. Escrow is going to send them documentation saying, what are the HOAs you pay dues on? So I've had at least one occasion where somebody forgot one. And of course, then they come back to us and to the seller saying, well, I'm going to be living there for 10 years, and I want you to make up that additional money I'm going to be paying for the next 10 years. Yeah. So I would know if there's an HOA. There could be 3 HOAs, as a matter of fact. So keep that in mind. Certainly, the condominiums and these planned unit developments, typically there's at least 2. And then the common interest disclosures, they're lengthy. You have an obligation to review those common interest disclosures as much as you don't want to, and actually you have an obligation to review all these disclosures with your buyer. And you should at least say, I'm prepared to go over all my disclosures to you, put in writing, tell me when you're ready. And if they decline, that's a different story, but you should always be going through these disclosures with them. So with common interest disclosures, what should you be getting? Well, HOA should be providing 12 months worth of minutes, and the minutes are some of the most important documents, I would say. Not every HOA has a monthly meeting, so it could be quarterly, could be every 2 months. So that's something you'll figure out when you get the common interest disclosures. The other aspect that's really critical is the budget and the reserves. So we're seeing more and more now condominiums in California not having sufficient reserves or unable to get insurance. So what does that mean? Those are now deemed non-warrantable condos, meaning Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac will not provide financing. So, and the list is growing as a matter of fact. So if you're engaged in a transaction, sometimes I've looked at these condos and you wonder, why is the price lower? Because many times they're non-warrantable condos. The reserves are only funded at 20% of the required dollar amount. So what does that mean? Most likely you buy that property, you're probably gonna have special assessments. Or your monthly dues are going to go up. Somehow, they're gonna have to cover them. So those are important aspects. And then the other aspect, there's something called, there's two different things that should reveal litigation in a homeowners association. A homeowners association demand, and that's a common document that's the seller has an obligation to pay for through escrow. And all of the documents the seller is obligated to pay for is relegated by Civil Code 4525. So that should indicate whether or not there is any litigation in the condominium project. And then other things that happen in a transaction when there is a condominium, the lender may dictate whether if they want an HOA certification. An HOA certification will also reveal litigation, but it's a lengthy questionnaire. And why don't we have escrow order that every single time? First of all, that is not a document that the seller has an obligation to pay for. And now we're seeing with HOAs for this HOA condo cert, it's ranging between $400 to $600. It's expensive. Yeah, it's crazy. You know, especially if you're trying to get rush fee, you're paying a rush fee because everything is in a rush. And many times lenders, they don't decide early on if they want that HOA certification. So I would recommend if you're representing a buyer in a condo and you speak to the lender, prompt them. Say, hey, do we need the HOA certification? Because sometimes they're 12, 15 days into the transaction now, making a demand on escrow that they get this HOA certification. So the HOA demand is one of the normal documents that's requested by escrow. The HOA certification is not a document that is typically requested early on in a transaction. Probably simply because of the cost. And then if there's litigation, depending upon the litigation, sometimes lenders will not have interest. Any questions about that? Yep. Okay. L8, review of leased or lien items. Solar panels that's the best example I can give you. So leased solar panel, the obligation is typically assumable. If it's a purchase, rarely is it ever assumable, even though it's financed. So if it's not assumable, then the seller is going to have to pay it off with of escrow. And that's an ugly amount typically, because these solar companies, they offer these great incentives. First year, you don't have to pay anything.
Maybe I'm too late for that.
So, and if you don't pay it off at a certain time, then the back interest accrues also. So that's something that's very, very important as a matter of fact. And there's a solar addendum that I would suggest having the seller complete. So escrow will struggle and every single time trying to get these things assigned if it's a lease, and usually we're successful in getting it done.
It's almost like another loan.
It is,
Yeah.
that's exactly what it is. And then the contract, you know, the body of the contract stipulates that the seller has no obligation, if it's something that's assumable by the buyer, they have no obligation to pay it down. But if it's not assumable, then they're gonna have to pay it off. And then the other thing that comes into play, and it's not so common here, but Hero and PACE loans, those are energy efficiency loans, excuse me, that you can obtain for windows, things like that. And it's on the property owner's tax bill. So those are other things that you would be, or the seller would be required to disclose. And it's a hero or PACE loan, something that's on the tax bill. The lender who's providing financing to the buyer will require that that's paid off on the close of escrow.
That shows up on the procedure.
It should, but then also if you'll get a tax bill, you'll see a line item on the tax bill. And we did have one example in which the lender, we were representing the seller, and it was disclosed in 3 different areas, and the lender didn't catch it, they closed the loan. And then they came back to us and we said, "It's disclosed in 3 areas, see ya." So unfortunately, yeah. You think it's never going to happen, but it does happen. And then L9, sale of buyer's property. If the offer is contingent upon the sale of the buyer's property, we should check that box. And I'm not going to go through that entire form, but just from what I can recall, there's different ways to structure the contingency for the sale of my existing home as the buyer. I can make it contingent upon me entering into escrow and closing escrow. I can make it contingent upon me just entering escrow. And if you take these different examples, the listing agent or seller is entitled to the documentation or evidence once you do enter escrow to sell your property. And then if you structure the COP in a manner such that the contingency is based on not only me entering an escrow, but selling the property, that contingency can be structured such that it doesn't expire until the close of escrow of this property, the subject property. So if I'm saying a 30-day close here, then my contingency for selling my existing property will go the full 30 days here. So those forms, they're not necessarily clear. If you have questions and you're structuring an offer, let me know. Or if you're getting offers on a listing and you have questions about the COP, let me know. And then, N1, seller delivery of documents, well, all the seller disclosures. And what's important about that? The investigation contingency is so broad, it's not just the seller's disclosures, but it can be a termite report the seller's supposed to provide. If they're not all delivered, then the buyer doesn't have an obligation to remove the investigation contingency. So let's not put ourselves in that position. Sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions. It's saying 5 days after delivery. Well, what happens if one of the parties doesn't sign the escrow instructions or return them and send a notice for 4 months? So it's that typically. And then time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents. The seller has an obligation, and escrow manages it for them, to pay for the HOA or common interest disclosures. And it's supposed to be done within 3 days after acceptance of the contract. And then install smoke detectors, small smoke alarms. Let me try that again. Carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing. Well, it's supposed to be done within 7 days of acceptance. So why is that important? If there's a loan and the appraiser comes out before those items are installed or corrected, and they have to come out for reinspection, the contract states the seller's gonna have to pay for the cost of the reinspection. And then evidence of representative authority. So there's a corporation that made an offer on the property, it's been accepted. So at 3 days after acceptance, they have to provide proof that whoever signed has authority to act on behalf of that entity. Or it could be a family trust, for example. If it's a family trust, you don't have to have the actual trust, you can have a certification of trust. That's acceptable also. So escrow and Tyler won't need that, but you should also have that. You should be questioning people when they're submitting an offer on behalf of an entity. And then section P1, items included and excluded. If you're ever unsure, check the boxes. Even though further down in section 9, I think it talks about all the things that are included, just check the boxes. Or if you want certain things removed, maybe there's some ugly wall units. If you want it removed. And then section Q1, natural hazard zone disclosure. Customary here that the seller pay, anyone can pay, and be sure to check the box environmental. And you can choose the name of the provider if you like, and I just happen to type in First American NHD. Optional wildfire disclosure report, I see no reason for that. And then Q3, if we want a termite report or pest control report, the one on the side, it's common that the seller pay for that. And this is just simply for the cost of the report, not the cost of remediation event. And if there's any acceptable reports you want the seller to pay for. You know, one thing I see a lot of offers, people will say buyers are entitled to perform any type of inspections they want that are non-invasive. A lot of times, agents will write in that the buyer is gonna pay for their own, physical inspection. I'm not sure. If you put that in the purchase contract, the lender may look at that and say, I want a copy of the physical inspection. So there's no, if the buyer's just gonna pay for it, why put it in there? Especially for the physical inspection. And then Q4, smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing. It's common the seller pay for the remediation. Section Q5 and Q6, government required point of sale inspections reports, government required point of sale corrective remedial actions. So in Orange County, really about the only aspect that applies are water conservation and plumbing fixtures, and that's for pre-1994 properties. In LA, every single home requires an inspection. So section Q5 is the cost of report, Q6 is the cost of remediation. So if you're here in Orange County, I suggest leaving it blank, or if you're representing the buyer, say the buyer pays. If you're buying a home that's older than 1994 and it hasn't been remodeled, and it's likely that the plumbing fixtures and toilets haven't been replaced, then if you check box for seller may have to pay for all that. So it's going to make your offer less advantageous. Q7 escrow fee. I suggest each to pay their own fees because maybe your client can get a discount and another one won't. You say both and they're splitting and then each gets a benefit of the discount. And we always suggest sterling escrow. That's how I make money here. And then owner's title. It's customary the seller pay. I just typed the owner's title. That's what I would recommend. But many times if it's a competitive situation for escrow and title, you might even say seller's choice. You might be faced with something like that. Then Q10, county transfer tax and fees. It's customary the seller pay, and that's $1.10 per thousand. In certain areas of LA, it's $4.40 per thousand. Yeah, it's crazy. City transfer tax and fees. There are none that I am aware of around here in Orange County. If you're not sure, specify who it is, then you can type to the right if applicable. At least it puts the party on notice that you understand that hey, it may not be there, but let's just address it. And then Q12 and Q13, HOA fee for preparing disclosures, HOA certification fee. You can see the HOA certification fee. That's what we talked about earlier, that one that's $400 to $600. The default in the contract is that it's the buyer's responsibility. And then Q12, it's actually relegated by Civil Code 4525. And it requires, the state law requires that the seller pay for all of those documents. Q14, HOA transfer fees, that is negotiable. It's customary that the seller pay. Private transfer fees, you can see the default is that the seller pays, and the only private transfer fees I'm aware of in Orange County is the barrel inch. Or something like that. Q16, Q17, if there's anything else that you want to put in there, so don't put in physical inspection of our bank. Like that. And then Q18, if you want the seller to pay for a home warranty, let's insert that information there. And then these costly home warranties have gone up dramatically. If the home warranty is greater than the credit you're asking from the seller, then the buyer would pay the difference. And then, if you remember, Richard Moore is the buyer, and Richard Moore is also representing himself under Section R. Buyer's license by the California Department of Real Estate. So that is something that you must disclose. Or if you're representing a related party, you must disclose the fact that you're related to the buyer, you as the agent. Any questions about that? A lot of these things I'm going to skip over down here because we've gone through a lot of it. Isn't that the biggest? Yeah. Let's see, section 6. Additional finance, well, let's go back to, section E. 5E. Limits on credits to buyer. Everybody on that page? We had talked about negotiating a credit. And if the credit exceeds the total closing costs that I have, this paragraph addresses what we talked about. That I may lose that difference unless I specify that the unused credit is used as a reduction in purchase price. So there is the language in there. So there is no automatic adjustment to the purchase price. Then also, under section 6C, buyer stated financing. So 6 is additional financing terms, 6C, buyer stated financing. Cash is considered or defined as a form of financing here. So what we see often, people will say, oh, I'm gonna pay all cash, and you check the box, all cash. And then everybody finds out suddenly that buyer's actually going to get a loan, maybe a hard loan. Does the seller have to cooperate? Well, they don't have to cooperate. They can't prevent the transaction from closing. The buyer still has an obligation to close as agreed, that it's not a breach of contract. Basically, this contract is designed. When you're listing a property, we're relying on the representations of those buyers, and if they say all cash, and you show me that you have all cash, and now suddenly you're not gonna pay all cash, well, maybe I would have chosen somebody else that was getting financing, was offering more. So it makes people angry. But it's a tactic that's used.
Why is it a big deal to have a cash buyer rather than something financing? At the end of the day, the money that's coming to the seller is going to be the same either way.
Yeah.
Why do people?
I think, well, buyers sometimes think that they have the upper hand because they're paying all cash, so I should get a discount. From my perspective, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I want more money. But then the seller looking at it thinking, is it riskier if it will close? Will it close? That's the concern. So, and then, a lot of times if you're representing a seller and you're getting an offer that says all cash and it's an entity, with flipping homes, and they give these odd letters and things like that. They don't give bank statements, but even if they give you some kind of a statement or a letter, they may be buying 10 or 20 properties. So that's something else to give consideration to. Maybe that money in the bank is good enough to buy your property, that maybe they have all these other offers out. So yeah, these hard money loans are very common with investors, where they tell you all cash and then they change the circumstances during the transaction. Let's see. And then I'm going to skip down to section 7B, condition of property. Property shall be delivered as is. That means in the condition in which you found it as of the date of acceptance. And then section D in there, 7D, some remaining possession at the close. Sometimes there are lease backs. And maybe the seller's paying or not paying. If the lease back is for 29 days or less, we would use something called a sell in possession form. If it's for more than 29 days, a residential lease after sale. So we would document the occupancy. We want to do that. And then let's see, 7F. The seller has an obligation to provide all keys, codes, things like that. And then what if it is a lease back? The seller still has an obligation to the buyer to provide keys to the property. So they can't say, well, I know you're going to come to my house. And it's not an excuse, right? They have an obligation to provide that to the buyer. And then we talked about the loan. Well, one thing I didn't talk about, if you're getting a loan, and the appraised value comes in lower. Let's assume I said I'm keeping my loan contingency, but I waive my appraisal contingency. The appraisal comes in lower. If I still qualify for the $800,000 in financing, then I can cancel based upon the loan. So if the appraisal comes in lower, and I still qualify for the loan amount I said that I was going to obtain, I can't cancel based upon the loan contingency. Talked about investigation of property, insurance, review of seller documents. Common, interest disclosures. Review of lease and lien items. And then removal of contingencies, so if in the event we said we're going to remove contingencies at day 17. If you're the listing agent, what can you do if the buyer doesn't do it? Well, first of all, if as the listing agent, if you don't deliver all disclosures or whatever contingency that is, assuming there's an obligation to deliver something, then the buyer has an obligation to remove that contingency. So if I don't deliver all my seller disclosures, then the buyer doesn't have to remove their contingencies until I do that. And then let's assume that on day 17, me as the listing agent finally delivers the last seller disclosure to the buyer. Well, he still have 5 more days following delivery. So it extends the contingency period. Now your seller is going to be very happy. Section 9, items included in and excluded from sale. This talks about all the different aspects that should be, that are included in the property, fixtures, so on and so forth, that term. And then a couple things in regards to homes. When people sell their home, a lot of people have things hanging on the wall. So the seller has no obligation to patch the holes for nails and things like that. If there is a TV bracket and remove the TV bracket, then they have an obligation to patch it, but not paint it. And a lot of times when people patch the little pinholes from small nails and paint it, it looks worse. So you may not want to get into that.
So leave it alone.
Just leave it alone, exactly, and that's what the contract says. We don't have any obligation to do that. Skip down here. Statutory to section 11, statutory and other disclosures, including ledge-based paints. Statutory disclosures meaning part of the law, transfer disclosure statement, natural hazard disclosure. There can be some exemptions to transfer disclosure statement, for example. Lead-based disclosure, section B, it is not waivable. Home fire hardening disclosure and advisory, that's when a transfer disclosure statement is required. The home fire hardening disclosure and advisory is required. Section D, defensible space disclosure and addendum. This is a hot issue in California. That's required. If a TDS is not required, then the home fire hardening disclosure and defensible space disclosure is not required. Like disclosures, it's not waivable. Why is a TDS not required? Well, virtually anyone that's an investor or owner of a property has to provide a transfer disclosure statement. However, let's assume I die and my beneficiary wants to sell the property and they haven't lived in the property during the past year. That's an exemption for providing a TDS. And that also means then the fire hardening disclosure and defensible space disclosure is not required. So what happens if you provide them anyways? It's okay. I see nothing wrong with giving more disclosure than less disclosure. And then the other aspect about the seller disclosure. So the main seller disclosures that really affect us, the transfer disclosure statement and the seller property questionnaire. So upon delivery, there is a rescission right. So they can terminate the contract upon 3 days if delivered personally, or 5 days if delivered electronically or via first-class mail. So that means a lot. Let's assume that a buyer has even removed their investigation contingency, and now I've delivered my transfer disclosure statement and seller property questionnaire. It opens up a rescission period. So if they see something in there that most likely should be deemed material, they can cancel the contract. So you need to be careful about getting those disclosures submitted as soon as possible in the transaction when representing a seller. See, I'm looking at this one. It's a lot. That's like, yeah. Yeah. And today, yeah, I think it's just a different thing, right? I think it's just a matter of being aware. That's really what's important. Talked about the common interest disclosures, known material facts. So let's another example. So we have given all the seller disclosures, the transfer disclosures in the seller property questionnaire, and then the buyer has some additional investigation performed, and they get a report. and it's not, and whatever that deficiency is on the report, it's not disclosed by the seller, does that open up the rescission period? No, it doesn't. If they ask you to amend those seller disclosures, you have no obligation to do that. Even if me as a seller obtains a third-party report and I give it to the buyer, and there's a deficiency that wasn't disclosed on the seller disclosures, it does not open the rescission period. That me as a seller, if I notify the buyer that I have found this crack in the slab, that opens up the rescission period. So there's a difference between a third-party report and me as a seller amending the information that I've given. So I came across something that was disclosed or provided to me through a third-party report. I'd give them a report and nothing more. I do not amend my disclosures. Title investing, well, it's obviously how a property is vested is very important to a buyer. Often buyers used to take property in marriage, I'll just say examples, joint tenants presumes right of survivorship, but the tax benefits aren't as good as community property right of survivorship. So if you, because people ask me, we shouldn't be telling them how to invest in property. But if it's a married couple and they say, I'll take these joint tenants, you might suggest to them, give it some thought as to community property right of survivorship, and I'll tell you why. If I take the property as joint tenants and one spouse dies, then the surviving spouse gets a step up in value of 50% of the property to today's market value. But if I take it as community property right of survivorship, and one spouse dies, I get a complete 100 step up in basis to today's value. So if I bought the property for $500,000, or me and my wife did it for $500,000, I pass on. Now her cost basis will be deemed to be $1 million, my example. Community property right of survivorship. She sells it for $1 million, she has no tax on it. Whereas in the other example, if it's joint tenants, then there's going to be a step up of $250,000, meaning there is a basis of $750,000, and now a taxable gain of $250,000. Now you might have other exemptions, for homeowners exemption and things like that, but it's a dramatic change or benefit to somebody. And the other aspect is a lot of times people will, and this is something to tell your clients, if they have deeded their properties into their trust, if they're true, and it was held in joint tenancy, and the trust doesn't indicate that it's intended that all property received by the trust is to be held as community property, they're going to lose that benefit that I was just describing to you. So there's a big difference there. You know, if you're talking to people, how they transfer their property, if they held it as joint tenants, if their trust doesn't reflect that all properties intended to be held as community property, they can lose that benefit.
So Richard, can you repeat, if you have a trust,
Mhm.
they can lose it? It's not stated as survivor?
Well, let's assume they held the property as joint tenants.
Okay.
Right, and so they're only gonna get a 50% step up in basis upon the death of one of the individuals. And but remember dies, and then they transfer it into their family trust. So they transfer property as held as joint tenants into a family trust. But the trust didn't say that the intent was for all property granted to the trust to be held as community property. So then it's presumed it's held as joint tenants. Then they can lose the full 100% step up in basis.
Because community property is husband and wife, just.
Yeah, so joint tenancy can be, it's just, from a tax standpoint, they get this additional benefit regards to the step up in basis for the property that was granted to the trust. So that is a big difference. Anybody else want to repeat that? Jonathan?
No, it makes sense because
No.
community property, husband and wife automatically, but joint tenant, maybe somebody else, not husband and wife, correct?
No, usually joint tenancy, it's taking title with no division. And joint tenancy is usually used for married couples.
For marriage.
Yeah, let's assume you're an investor. And you and your friend buy a property and it's held as joint tenants. So if you die, your friend, your partner is gonna own 100% of that property, and yet you wanted to give half your property to your descendants.
Mhm.
So that's a reason to not do it.
Okay. Makes sense.
And we're getting to the end here, because I can only talk so much longer.
Yeah.
We're not at the end, but. Time, that's section 14, time frames, removal of contingencies. So in the preceding paragraphs, each line item has a specific time frame for the contingency. So you can change that. Let's assume that the only way, if you're a seller, you can force somebody to remove a contingency, first of all, you need to give them all the disclosures necessary. And then let's assume the buyer, you've given them all those disclosures, and we're at day 17, this is the fall time frame. The buyer has removed their contingencies. What can you do? You can send them something called a notice to perform. When you send a notice to perform, that means the buyer has 2 additional days to remove those contingencies. So if you want to be aggressive, because it makes people angry when you send notice to perform. You've done it, Michael. You can send a notice to perform as soon as 2 days prior to the expiration of a contingency. So you can do that. So if let's see, the 17th day falls on Thursday, I want to send a notice to perform on Tuesday. They have till Thursday at 11:59 p.m. to remove their contingencies. The following day, Friday, if they haven't, at 12:01 a.m., I can cancel the contract. This is it. Want to make sure that we've done everything. But then here's the other example. So let's assume the 17th day falls on Saturday. Well, I can give them that notice to perform on Thursday, right? 2 days before. But they're actually going to have until the following business day to remove those contingencies. So the execution of the event cannot fall on a weekend or a holiday. So you have to watch those time frames. Does that make sense? Okay, great. And if they don't remove their contingencies, the contingencies just live on until you force a situation. And now let's assume they remove their, can you close a transaction if you have removed contingencies? Yes, you can. You don't have to remove contingencies. And then if all contingencies have been removed, and now the seller is past the close of escrow date, or the buyer is past the close of escrow date, what can the seller do? Well, they can submit a demand to close escrow. We would never use a notice to perform to force them to close escrow. But when you send a demand to close escrow, they have 3 more days. So you can send it 3 days before the intended close of escrow. I don't recommend doing that. You know, once you get into a situation where you feel that the party's not going to perform, then that's the applicable time, or the appropriate time to take those actions. Or like that's like cancellation. We talked, one of the things that we talked about repairs. So repairs, you know, you can negotiate a request for repairs when a request for repairs is submitted by a buyer to a seller. Seller has no obligation to respond to the request. And it's rare that a buyer won't remove their contingencies if there's a lot of repairs to be done, and the seller hasn't responded. Skip on down here. We talked about assignment, right? So we did that already. And just a few of the definitions. Acceptance. I submit an offer to Michael. Michael's sellers sign today. They return it tomorrow. Tomorrow is the date of acceptance. So when we start counting days to determine the 17 days for contingencies, a 30-day close of escrow, the date of acceptance is day 0. So if acceptance occurs today, and we're going to close in 30 days, tomorrow is day 1. Tomorrow counted. If the 30th day for the close of escrow falls once again on a weekend or a holiday, it falls to the following business day, and that's the same thing for contingencies. Now, when isn't that true? If there is an offer that's submitted by a buyer, and remember an offer, when it's submitted, the default time frame is that the offer is valid for 3 days. 3 days following the date of the last signature. So if the buyer signed it 2 days ago, and I submit that offer to the seller today, we're going to get 1 day to respond before that offer expires. And it doesn't matter if it expires in a weekend or a holiday. So counting days, once again. If we accept today, tomorrow's day 1. Same thing when counting the days for the contingency period. So accept it today, Tomorrow is day one, we're counting down the days to remove contingencies. We talked about liquidated damages. If there is any kind of dispute in the contract, mediation is required. There's an exception such as small claims action. So liquidated damages and arbitration of disputes, those are optional paragraphs. So what takes place if there's two sellers and two buyers, but only 3 of the 4 parties initial those paragraphs? Then the contract is not considered complete. So you're gonna have to issue a counter offer, and the counter offer actually has language in it indicating that it would be excluded unless you include it specifically in the counter offer. So there's default language in there. And people typically ask, should I sign a liquidated damage? Well, first of all, liquidated damage it's gonna limit the damages that a buyer would incur in the event of default. But liquidated damages has nothing to do with this. So if the seller defaults on a transaction, that one now. I don't want to close escrow. No, you're doing close escrow. Liquidated damages doesn't apply, but the seller, the buyer is going to win because you signed a contract, all contingencies have been removed. They're going to will list penance against the property and they're going to sue you for specific performance and they're going to recover all their costs and fees. So you should just go for it. I think he decided he's going to go for it. And arbitration, once again, it's just a form of litigation, but hopefully with less costs. So that's why I would suggest so many initial paragraphs. And then we're going to just skip on down here to one other thing. When you're writing an offer, you have access through Realist on the MLS, or we can help you with our title rep. You should be inserting the name of the song. And you can find that information through Realist on the MLS when you look up the information on the MLS, or you can use something called title profile to confirm who the seller is, and that's important. If you're listing property, also if you're going to list property, you should actually be looking up how the property is best and knowing who the owners of the property are. Because if that's just your Richard Moore's name, you know, only Richard Moore has to sign the listing contract. But if it's in the Moore Revocable Family Trust, perhaps both Richard and his spouse, if there is one, have to sign also, and that's typical for a revocable trust. And if you don't have all signatures, yeah, you have a listing contract, but then you have to disclose it on the MLS that not all parties necessary to sign the listing contract have signed that listing contract. So it puts them on notice that you may not be able to sell their property.
What is that code?
Their property marks. And then let's just look at how we sign this. So if it's just an individual buyer, it's very simple. But if it's an entity that's buying it, in this case, I said, so I said under section D, seller signatures, the Fasola Trust. And then just below that, I have John Fasola. That's the authorized signer, and his title is trustee. So knowing the title, their authority, that's all very important. And the name of it. In this case, we're saying the seller is actually the Fasola Trust. And John Fasola is the person who's authorized to sign on behalf of the trust. If it's just John Fasola who owns it, and that's how it's vested, then that would be the name of the seller. So I think I'm done for the day. Anyone have any questions specifically?
How many people lose the will to live before they get to the end of the form?
You know, actually, yeah, it's interesting, Donna. You know, when people send these things electronically, I would say 95% of the people that send them out electronically never review them, their files.
Really?
Yeah.
I actually think it's like not a good idea.
You're right. It's not a good idea. You know, people now have electronic signatures, they're really not reading these things.
That's some awful lot.
It's a lot, right? And that's just, you know, and there's all the other ancillary forms that our companies do. And then remember, you must also sign the real estate broker section for confirmation of agency. And that is, once again, it's required statutory.
Yes.
We're done, Carlos, that's what
She's
she's
excited about the contract.
Oh, okay,
I'm
you should
sorry
have
for
said
talking.
something, we could take a break.
No. We're on the roll.
Try to keep it up. Any other questions then before we wrap it up? No.
Later when
You know, that's exactly what you should be doing now. You're aware of much more in the contract, and when you're going through it, I would always suggest you come to Carlos, myself, John, and go over that contract with you, so you're comfortable in regards to what's going on. And I can assure you, everybody in this room knows much more than your clients do about these purchase contracts. So you should feel much more confident, as a matter of fact, they will never read all the documentation that's in here.
Very good.
The only read that's on the sheet.
That's right.
So before everybody goes, so, and on counteroffers. So if someone's gonna counter something, they're only gonna counter something that they wanna change, and then all other terms remain unless you specify it, correct?
Correct, and you don't have to specify all other terms remain the same, this presumed,
Right, so that's what I'm saying.
yes.
So only what's addressed is changed to whatever you guys agree to, but otherwise, so if there's something that's changed in the counteroffer, maybe it's the price, all of the terms remain. If the number of days of escrow, then the price remains and everything else, so just keep that in mind.
Yeah, when writing a counteroffer, what I suggest is referring to the specific section. And say, if you want to change the contingency period, section 3L1 shall be 10 days. That way, there's just complete clarity, or the sales price shall, you can reference the section there also. So I think that's a better way to approach it. For me, I think any type of clarity is going to prevent any issues.
Thank you.
Okay? All right, well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.